What is going on, guys? We have taking place this weekend the card that I have been looking forward to the most, probably since UFC 300. Honestly, I might even be looking forward to it more than UFC 300 because in the main event this weekend, we have Max Holloway taking on Ilia Topuria, which is just a sick fight. And there's also a number of other great fights on the card. I mean, the co-main event, we've got Khamzat Chimaev taking on Robert Whittaker. First time we've seen Chimaev fight in a while. So I'm really looking forward to this as well as breaking it down for you guys. So if you could do me a favor while you're watching this, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and then also let's do a contest considering it's a massive pay-per-view event. In the main event, like we said, we got Ilia Topuria taking on Max Holloway. No fighter in UFC history has landed more significant strikes than Max Holloway. No fighter in UFC history has absorbed more significant strikes than Max Holloway. Every fight that he's in, it's a banger. So I want to know from you guys, who wins the main event and how many fantasy points do they score? Whoever ends up getting closest to the correct answer, I'll give you a free subscription to our Sims product. And all you have to do, once again, just leave a comment below. Who wins the main event? How many fantasy points do they score? And then whoever gets closest, going to set you up with a free subscription to our site. Other than that, guys, let's start breaking it down, beginning with that main event, Ilia Topuria taking on Max Holloway. And the betting line is absurdly wide for this fight, in my opinion. Like, I don't mind Topuria being the favorite because I actually do think that he has more paths to win, but not to the point that he should be a north of minus 200 favorite. I think it should be much more competitive than that. And also because of how big of a favorite Topuria is, it's reflected in the ownership, where we currently have Topuria projected for nearly 50% ownership and Max Holloway on the other side projected for around 30% ownership. So I think you guys probably know where I'm going to be going with this, especially if you're clever enough to look at the screen and see what my exposures are. I've got 60% of Max Holloway, and then on the other side of Topuria, I've got 40%. It's a fight that I definitely want to have exposure in all of my lineups to on one side or the other, but in a fight that I think should be competitive, I want to get more exposure to the Max Holloway side, considering he's cheaper and he's going to be the lesser owned fighter of the two. The breakdown of how the fight is actually going to go is I think there's kind of a path to victory for Topuria that's probably not being talked about all that often, which is if Topuria has wrestling success, he's a much better grappler than Max Holloway. And we could actually see Topuria turn this into a game style for himself and game plan where he comes out and just looks to really wrestle heavy. And if he lands takedowns, maybe he could dominate Max on the ground. But we've never seen anybody do that to Max Holloway. He defends takedowns at an 84% clip. And in the past, when he has been taken down, he's gotten back up very quickly. So actually looking through Max Holloway's fights, he hasn't been taken down multiple times since Alexander Volkanovski, and that was a fight between them 4 years ago since we've seen Holloway taken down multiple times. Before then, it was the fight against Brian Ortega back in 2018. So it's hard for me to say that it's a very likely outcome. It's just a possible one that I wanted to put out there. So that is a way for Topuria to score big fantasy points. But then on the feet, Topuria, while he is the more powerful striker of the two, we've never seen Max Holloway significantly hurt. So it's hard for me to predict that Ilia Topuria is going to knock out Max Holloway. So if the fight is going to be going to the judge's decision, and in the past, Holloway doesn't get taken down very often, and in addition, we've never seen Holloway get hurt, then we have to think the most likely outcome here is the fight goes to decision. And in that scenario, it's just so hard to win decisions against Max Holloway unless you're somebody like Alexander Volkanovski, who in his prime was just a next level striker, because Max Holloway lands absurd volume, over 7 significant strikes per minute. And then if you look at his fights that go to the judges' scorecards, I mean, 180, well, this one didn't go to the judges' scorecards, but basically went the entirety of the fight. 181 significant strikes landed against Justin Gaethje, 147 against Arnold Allen, and that was honestly like a low output relative to other spots for Max Holloway. In a win over Yair Rodriguez, 230 significant strikes, and of course the Calvin Kattar fight where he landed 445 significant strikes. In Topuria's career, he landed 152 against Josh Emmett. But beyond that, he's been kind of a lowish output striker. So if this is going to go to the judge's decisions, I would have to favor Max Holloway to win. And that is actually what I'm picking the outcome to be. Max Holloway to win this fight by decision, regain the featherweight belt, where then he would be the BMF champion as well as the featherweight champion, and love him for leverage for DFS purposes. Honestly, too, Max Holloway's output is so crazy. There's a scenario where he does end up losing this fight, but maybe he still gets into the optimal lineup at $7,400 if he lands 200 plus significant strikes. But a lot of leverage plays I like on this slate, and that starts with Max Holloway. But another one that I like is in the co-main event. Robert Whittaker taking on Khamzat Chimaev, and we have not seen Chimaev fight in a while now. He's dealt with health issues. Supposedly, there's visa issues that don't allow him to travel to the United States, which is something else that's prevented him from being able to compete regularly, because you got this guy who has got health issues. He's got trouble cutting weight. He can only fight in one part of the world. So you get this spot where it's like he's only available to fight on a couple of cards per year. And if all of the stars don't align for him, meaning he's healthy at the time, he has no issues cutting weight, well, that means Chimaev doesn't fight. So this is a guy who was so exciting when he first came into the UFC because he fought 2 weeks in a row. And now you've got a guy who hasn't fought in a year. Before that, he hadn't fought in a year. So it's just a guy who hasn't been nearly as active as he was earlier in his career. And you do wonder what kind of an impact that might have on cage rust or how prepared he's going to be for this fight. And he's going up against such a great veteran in Robert Whittaker. And on top of all that with Chimaev too, I have massive questions about his cardio. I thought that Kamaru Usman won the fight 29-28 against Chimaev. Easy first round win for Chimaev, takes Usman down, lands some ground and pound, nothing too significant, but nearly finished the fight a couple times with chokes. But Chimaev was gassed out by the time the second round came around, and I thought Usman won the second and third round. So while clearly the most dominant round of the fight was what Chimaev did in the first round, and the second round was kind of competitive, judges scored towards towards Chimaev. I thought Usman won. Then the third round was a clear win for Usman. I thought Usman should have won 29-28. And if that fight was a 5-round fight, I think Usman easily wins the fourth and fifth rounds, maybe even finishes Chimaev, considering how tired Chimaev looked in just the second round of a 3-round fight. So with that in mind, he's going to be fighting Robert Whittaker. And what happens if Chimaev doesn't finish Whittaker in the first round? Well, I think Whittaker starts to take over in the later stages of the second round, the third, the fourth, the fifth round. So that's why I'm also picking another upset here, Robert Whittaker to win. I think he's going to finish Khamzat Chimaev in the third or fourth round as Chimaev starts to tire. I don't want to completely write off Chimaev because he's so ridiculously dangerous, and we have seen Whittaker hurt before. There's absolutely a scenario here where Robert Whittaker either lands takedowns in the first round and submits Robert Whittaker, or maybe just overwhelms him with pace, power, and pressure on the feet, kind of like what Dricus du Plessis did to Robert Whittaker and ended up finishing him in the second round. But I think Robert Whittaker is kind of being written off a little bit in this fight as a north of a plus 200 underdog in this spot. Once again, I said there's pretty big upside in Chimaev because I do think his win condition is either a first or an early second round finish. And if that happens, he's going to score well for DraftKings, especially because the output is crazy on the Chimaev side. I mean, look at some of these stats on him. He lands nearly 6 significant strikes per minute, as well as 4 takedowns per 15 minutes. He fights like a bat out of hell in the first 6-7 minutes of fights. But if it gets extended, he's not able to finish Robert Whittaker. I think that Whittaker would end up coming from behind and end up winning that fight. So I want to be heavier on the Whittaker side. And I think there's a lot of similarities in the ownership on this fight to the main event, where because Chimaev is such a big favorite at $8,700, he's projected to be the most popular fighter on the card, north of 50% owned. I'm once again going to be looking for the leverage on Robert Whittaker. Now, again, I haven't written off Topuria. He's in 40% of my lineups. I haven't written off Chimaev. He's in 42% of my lineups. But I'm underweight to the field slightly on each of them while being well overweight to the veteran underdogs in each of the 5-round fights. So moving on here to the rest of the main card, which there are fights that I like on this main card for sure. Like I'm interested in Ankalaev versus Rakic. I'm interested in Murphy versus Ige. I'm interested in Sharamagomedov against Armen Petrosyan, which I think is going to be a banger of a fight on the feet. I actually don't love any of these fights for a DFS perspective. Starting with Ankalaev against Rakic, the biggest problem I have with Magomed Ankalaev is, as talented as he is, he makes horrendous decisions in the octagon and often has really boring fights. He only lands 3.5 significant strikes per minute. He lands 1 takedown per 15 minutes. And a lot of his fights, just nothing really happens until he ends up getting a finish or he does something stupid. Like if you guys remember the fight that he had against Paul Craig, his UFC debut, where Ankalaev is just comfortably winning the entire fight, not scoring all the well for DraftKings purposes because he only had 59 significant strikes, and then just dives into a triangle and taps with 1 second left in the fight after dominating the entire thing. We also saw the scenario where he had the blatant illegal strike against Johnny Walker, which led to that fight end up getting called off by the doctor and being a no contest. There was the draw against Jan Blachowicz, where for whatever reason, Ankalaev just refused to wrestle the entire fight. So he just has terribly boring fights and fights where he makes a lot of bad decisions, and that typically leads to some bad DraftKings scores. So There's a lot of other pay-up options I prefer on the slate to Magomed Ankalaev that I'm going to be prioritizing. I do think Ankalaev is the better fighter of the two between him and Rakic. But for DraftKings purposes, I'm going to play a side. I'm more inclined to play the Rakic side at just 12% projected ownership on Alexander Rakic, just because you don't know what kind of dumb shit Magomed Ankalaev is going to do in the fight and how that might cost him. There's also a little bit of a narrative here where Ankalaev should be in line for a title shot, but the UFC has been very hesitant to give it to him. And Ankalaev even said that Dana White told him that for him to get a title shot, he has to not only win this fight, but it also has to be a fun, exciting fight, or else he's going to get passed over again. So maybe that means Ankalaev will be a little bit more apt to open, could leave him to potentially get chinned by Alexander Rakic. So I'll pick Ankalaev to win by decision, but it's not a fight I really want to get a lot of exposure to, and I prefer Rakic as a punt at $6,800 for DraftKings purposes. Lerone Murphy taking on Dan Ige. Ige coming off the fight where he took Diego Lopez on what was it, like an hour and a half's notice or something. Diego Lopez was supposed to fight Brian Ortega, and Brian Ortega had some weight cut issues and then got sick and had to pull out of the fight. And as a result, what ends up happening is Dan Ige is down the street from the venue. He texts the matchmakers and says, put me in. And he just pulls up to the arena and fights on very, very short notice. And now we've got him on another pay-per-view main card taking on Lerone Murphy. And Murphy's been looking terrific as of late, continually getting better and improving fight over fight. The big thing we've seen Murphy add in recent fights is more output as well as offensive wrestling. And that's what I think is going to be the most easy path to victory for him in this fight. Dan Ige only defends takedowns at a 59% clip, and Murphy, who landed 4 takedowns against Edson Barboza, he landed 3 takedowns against Josh Coolabau. I think the most likely outcome here, Lerone Murphy looks to shoot takedowns. He holds a lot of top control position and just kind of puts up a decision win where he scores like 80 to 85 fantasy points. So I'm going to pick Murphy to win and Murphy to win by decision, but other pay-up options that I think have more of a scoring upside. And then also while the fight takes place on the feet, Dan Ige is massive power. So I think Murphy is going to be really, really wary of that. And that might lower the output a little bit in this fight as well. So I think it goes to judge's decision, not a fight I want to have a lot of exposure to. Shara Magomedov. A lot of consonants there. And for whatever reason, that came out of my mouth like I was having a stroke or something. But Shara Magomedov taking on Armen Petrosyan. And this is the matchup you want to see from both of these guys from an entertainment standpoint, because oftentimes we've seen Armen Petrosyan take on wrestlers, which typically doesn't go well for him because he has horrendous takedown defense. So we just saw him get taken down 3 times for Rodolfo Vieira and finished. There was also the fight against AJ Dobson, where even though Petrosyan got the win, he was taken down 3 times. He was taken down 4 times by Caio Bahayo. There is no threat of a takedown on either side of this fight. So we're going to get to see 2 fun, flashy strikers go at it on the feet. The one issue I have here is that I do think that both these guys have shown to be durable enough where I don't think a knockout is the most likely scenario. And then also, with no real wrestling or grappling upside, we're going to lose any control bonus potential points or any potential takedown points. So I think it takes place on the feet in what should be a fairly high output, fun fight to watch. I'm kind of skeptical how well it's going to score relative to some of the other fights on the card that are very likely to have either crazy high output in the striking or 5 rounds like the main event, or some of the other ones where I think a finish is a little bit more likely. So I'll play some of this fight just because I do think that the striking output should be high, but there's other spots that I prefer a little bit more. Right now, Shara Magomedov, I have in 24% of lineups, and then Petrosyan I have in 20%, which pretty reasonable for what I want my exposure to be. Somewhere around 20% of each of these guys. If they go off and one of them gets the early knockout, it wouldn't kill me, but it's also not something that I'm going to marry all my exposures to. Fun fight and a real potential for a fight of the night contender if it was not for Topuria and Max Holloway being in the main event, because they're potential for a lot of bangers on this card, including the next fight, Ibo Aslan taking on Rafael Cerquera. And here's what really stands out about this fight. 2 big guys. It's going to be taking place at 205 pounds. The majority of each of these guys' fights also finish inside the distance. And then if you check the betting odds for this fight, -600 to finish inside the distance. somebody's going to get knocked out in this fight. I don't know who it's going to be. This fight, at the time I'm recording, it is right around a pick 'em. You've got a little bit of line value on Cerqueira. He's minus 130 at a $8,000 price tag on DraftKings. That's going to make him the slightly more popular fighter of the two. You'll see here, Ibo Aslan, we've got project for 29% ownership. Cerqueira pulling 33%. With the fight being minus 600 to finish inside the distance, and this price right in the mid-range as a close to pick 'em fight, I want to be overweight to both sides. I think somebody's getting knocked out in this fight, and with this fight being priced where it is, that makes the winner very likely to land in the optimal lineup. I'll side with Cerqueira just because I think he is a little bit more well-rounded. I think his cardio might be a little bit better than Ibo Aslan. Aslan was really gassing out. We've seen him gas out really hard in previous fights, and then also was starting to tire a little bit in his last fight against Anton Turkalj. So I feel a little bit better about Cerqueira, but this is about as close to a pick'em as a fight is going to be, but a great fight to be targeting on DraftKings this weekend. The next spot that we have here to look at, it is Jeff Neal taking on Rafael dos Anjos. And really the question to me is just how much left in the gas tank does Rafael dos Anjos have at this point? He's going to be turning 40 on fight day. See here, born October 26, 1984. If this fight was taking place a few years ago, you would say that, hey, just really heavy wrestling and grappling-based game plan by RDA probably would be enough for him to stifle Jeff Neal. And the problem I just have now is at the age of RDA and then also the power on the Jeff Neal side, just what is RDA going to look like at this point in his career? We just don't see very many guys fighting all that well into their 40s. And then also RDA, look at the size difference. He's 5'8", whereas Jeff Neal is 5'11". RDA is the former lightweight champion. He really should be a lightweight, but he's just at an age where he can't cut down to 155 pounds anymore. So the betting line is pretty wide, but I think it is for good reason. It's because of the age on RDA. And if this fight is going to take place primarily on the feet, I think there's a good chance that RDA's durability could fail him. We've seen him hurt and knocked out a handful of times now over the course of his career. The fight against Gamrot, he didn't get finished in that one, but Gamrot doesn't really hurt or finish anybody. We did see RDA get hurt a couple of times against Vicente Luque. He got knocked out late against Rafael Fiziev. And so now you're looking at losses in 3 of his last 4 fights, turning 40 years old. I'm going to pick Jeff Neal to win, but this is a fight that most likely goes to the judges' scorecards. It's minus 150 at the sportsbooks to be determined by decision. And I do think there's a lot of other pay-up options that should finish and score really well. So I'll pick Jeff Neal to win, but Jeff Neal by decision. And that's going to make other fighters higher priorities for me. One of them is in this fight. Mateusz Raunbecki taking on Mitsibek Orolbai. And if you guys have watched any of Orolbai's fights, he fights with crazy, crazy wrestling pace. So Orolbai in his fight so far landed 7 takedowns against Uros Medic and just broke him and ends up finishing him in the second round. Against Elvis Brenner, he landed 5 takedowns, also had a knockdown in that fight. He's not the best on the feet, which is going to open up a possibility for Raunbecki, who's very dangerous in the first round, to potentially hurt and finish Mitsibek Orolbai. But in the scenario this fight gets extended past the first round, it's hard to not see Orolbai take over. We just saw Raunbecki in a fight against Diego Ferreira where Raunbecki nearly finishes Ferreira in the first round, knocks him down, and it was a fight that I thought the ref was close to stepping in and stopping it, but Ferreira ends up surviving the fight, and then just Raunbecki totally gassed out. Look at the stats per round in that one. Where round 1, you got the knockdown and 30 significant strikes from Raunbecki, and then things start to turn in round 2. He gets outstruck 40-16 in significant strikes in round 2. Then round 3, Ferreira 62 significant strikes to just 6 on the Raunbecki side before the ref ended up, Gary Copeland stepped in and stopped that fight. So with that last fight in mind and the kind of pace and pressure that Orolbai fights at, I think Orolbai puts up a massive score if this fight gets past the first round. I'll take some shots on Raunbecki just because he is so dangerous in the first round, and I do think he's the better and more powerful striker. But the most likely scenario here is that Orolbai just takes over in the later stages, either gets a submission in the second or third round, or even if it goes to the judges' scorecards, you could see Orolbai have one of those performances where he lands 5, 6, 7 takedowns in his 10+ minutes of control time. So I'm going to pick Orolbai to win. I'll pick him to win by third round submission at $9,100. I think he's a pay-up option with a massive amount of upside. And then Raunbecki, once again, I'll take a couple of shots of him in GPP, but if you're looking like a single lineup that you're playing, single entry, or just one lineup in a large field, Orolbai would be the side for me. Another good fight to target here, Abus Magomedov taking on Bruno Ferreira. And Ferreira, very dangerous in the early stages of the fight. He's got big-time power. We saw him with a brutal spinning elbow knockout against Dustin Stoltzfus in his last fight. The fight before that, he knocked out Phil Hawes, which, I mean, a lot of people knock out Phil Hawes, but Phil Hawes is a very talented fighter, so it was certainly an impressive win for Ferreira. But fight before that, he got sparked and knocked out by Nursultan Ruziboev, who's like 8 feet tall somehow at middleweight. So for whatever reason, Ruzbov is able to cut down and make a lot of weight despite his size. But Bruno Ferreira taking on Abus Magomedov. What really interests me here, Ferreira only has 60% takedown defense. And we saw Magomedov go to a pretty wrestling-heavy game plan in his last fight against Warlley Alves. We saw Magomedov land 6 takedowns. And while he only had 22 significant strikes, he did have 98 strikes overall and landing those 6 of 7 takedowns. With his price at $8,400, if he does something similar against Bruno Ferreira, which I think is very live considering the poor takedown defense of Bruno Ferreira, and also neither of these fighters have good cardio, but Bruno Ferreira specifically does not have good cardio. And it's also easy for Abus Magomedov to not get tired, like in the fight against Warlley Alves, if he's just landing takedowns and sitting on top and not having to do all that much or facing all that much pressure or resistance. That's why, I mean, you look at the scorecards, he won 30-26 on all of the scorecards in the last fight. So if Bruno Ferreira does not land an early knockout in this fight, I think Magomedov once again could land 4, 5, 6 takedowns and score 100 plus fantasy points at $8,400. So I want to be overweight to both sides of this fight. The upside of Bruno Ferreira for the knockout potential at a cheaper price point. And then Abus Magomedov, 26% owned at $8,400. I currently have him in 31% of lineup. So a little bit of a sneaky fight to target. Doesn't look like it's going to be pulling all that much ownership. I want to be overweight to both sides, but I'm picking Abus Magomedov to win. I think he wins by decision, but even in the decision, I think it could be wrestling based and score pretty well on DraftKings. Here's where we have some goofy fights with really expensive fighters coming up. Kennedy Nzechukwu. He is $9,700. He's the biggest betting favorite on the card, and he's not reliable at all. We just saw him in not a similar spot, but similar odds against Ovince St. Preux, where Nzechukwu was a massive favorite, and he just completely shit the bed. It was a pretty competitive fight on the feet, and just Nzechukwu, he got hurt, and then he just wasn't really able to recover throughout the fight. And to allow 143 significant strikes to Ovince St. Preux, it's pretty ridiculous because OSP typically does not fight at a very heavy pace. Chris Barnett, though, the problem on his side is he is built like a bowling ball. He probably shouldn't be fighting as a heavyweight at just 5'9". He's very fun and entertaining. He has an entertaining fight style. He does a bunch of backflips and whatnot. He's got a cool celebration when he wins. But Chris Barnett is really a one-round fighter before he typically starts to gas out. He's not very talented. He's just kind of a fun guy, which is enough to keep him on the roster. Kennedy Nzechukwu, he's the better talent. He's also more athletic of the two. But at $9,700, it's just so hard to get up to him. And he's so untrustworthy that do you want to invest that much of the salary cap in Kennedy Nzechukwu? And the answer for me is mostly no. I right now have him in 20% of lineups at $9,700. Like, if you could fit him in lineups, that's fine. I feel that way about a handful of the really expensive pay-up options on the slate. I'm picking Kennedy Nzechukwu to win. He probably gets a finish in the second or third round, but I don't trust him. And he's also so expensive that I think it's a really uphill climb for him to be in the optimal lineup. Next fight, Farid Basharat against Victor Hugo. Kind of similar stuff with Farid Basharat, other than he's not unreliable, but he's also not a great DraftKings scorer, where you see Basharat is somebody who has now fought 4 times in the UFC. He does have the one submission win over Kletzin Rodriguez, but that was not one that had like a massive score or anything like that. He had the fight against Taylor Lapalus where he won by decision, and there was fairly low output, 42 significant strikes, 5 takedowns against Damon Blackshear, 58 significant strikes, 3 takedowns. And then on the Contender Series, he had a decision win, but that was against really non-UFC caliber talent. So in the fights he's been in the UFC, he hasn't scored all that well relative to his price tags. And now, once again, you're looking at Farid Basharat priced at, let's see, what is the Basharat? Yeah, you got Basharat here priced at $9,600. So once again, like, if you could pay up for him, I wouldn't tell you can't play him. I just kind of find him hard to get to considering what we've seen his upside to be. I slightly prefer Kennedy Nzechukwu of the two, but it's not really all that strong of a lean of those two pay-up options. I'm not going to have a massive amount of ownership on either of them. I currently have Basharat in 6% of my lineups. Like, maybe I have 10 or something by the time we get to lock tomorrow, but he definitely won't be a core play for me or anything. But I'm picking him to win over Victor Hugo, picking him to win by decision. Ismail Nardiev against Bruno Silva. Nardiev is going to be very popular on the slate, and it's going to be because of the betting odds. He is currently been bet up to minus 180 favorite at the time that I'm recording here. So with Nardiev being 80, here we go. We've got Nardiev $8,300, and then also being as big of a betting favorite as he is. This ownership is going to come way up by the time we get to lock tomorrow. Right now, I have him at 25%, but betting odds continue to move, and they've moved even since we did our last ownership update. So by the time we get to lock tomorrow, I think he's going to be probably like the mid 30% ownership range. And while I get it from a betting sense standpoint and how a lot of people will just look at, hey, this is a fight where we got two fighters priced in the mid-range, but one guy is close to a minus 200 favorite, and if you'll just gravitate towards that guy, Nardiev's not a very good DraftKings score. 3.17 significant strikes landed per minute, lands 1.25 takedowns per 15 minutes. I also think this fight is kind of a coin flip to go to the judges' scorecards or not. And then also on the other side, Bruno Silva, he's looked kind of washed in his recent fights, but even despite that, I think this is the most challenging test Nardiev has had in quite some time. He's been out of the UFC, hasn't fought in the UFC since 2020, where he convincingly lost the decision to Sean Brady. So this is going to be the toughest test that Nardiev has had since that loss to Sean Brady in 4 years. He's been fighting on the regional scene. I think it's a close competitive fight, and one that I don't think the winner is going to score all that well on for DraftKings purposes. If we get to tomorrow and Nardiev does end up being like close to 40% owned, and maybe Bruno Silva is only like 15% owned, then I'd be looking at Bruno Silva for some leverage. But as I'm looking at it now, it's not a fight I have a crazy amount of interest in, just because I don't think the winner is going to score all that well. So I right now have Bruno Silva in 24% of lineups and Nardiev in 28%. But I'm more apt to be underneath those numbers when I finalize my lineups than I am to up my exposure. And now finally, the first fight on the card, another pay-up option I like, Hinat Fakhretdinov taking on Carlos Leal. So what I like about Fakhretdinov is we know he's going to wrestle. He lands 4.5 takedowns per 15 minutes. He also lands north of 4 significant strikes per minute. So when you look at some of the fights that Fakhretdinov has been in, we've seen some pretty good DraftKings scores, and usually he's really, really expensive because he's usually a massive betting favorite. But because we have other betting favorites that are even bigger than him, you got a pretty reasonable price tag on Fakhretdinov. He's only $8,900, modestly owned at 25%. And I think he has such a clear path to victory here against Carlos Leal that I like the potential for him to score well. Just go implement a wrestling-based game plan. And also, Fakhretdinov typically doesn't have great top control, which often leads to a lot of like rinse and repeat takedowns. Landed 7 against Brian Battle, landed 5 against Andres Michailidis. He landed 5 against Nicholas Dalby as well. So I think that's what we could see here. 5, 6, 7 takedowns for Fakhretdinov. He doesn't land the most amount of significant strikes. We often do see him land a pretty good amount of strikes. Like against Brian Battle, 43 significant strikes, but 102 total strikes. So he's a better DraftKings scorer than just the significant strikes indicate. And I think this is a good matchup for him against Carlos Leal, who's making his UFC debut. So Fakhretdinov, $8,900. Him along with Mitabek Orobai. Those are the two guys that I'm prioritizing the most, right around 9K outside of the fighters in the main event. So that's going to do it for me this week, guys. If you haven't done yet, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Don't forget to leave a comment below. Let me know who wins in the main event and also how many fantasy points do they score. And then on top of it, if you want to sign up for our MMA tools here, you can get projections, ownership projection. We've got a new package structure here as well. Sign up using the link below in the YouTube description box, and you can check out the different packages that we have. But yeah, we've lowered the prices, and then we've also got more tools on the site, like the single lineup simulator. So if you just want to hand build a single MMA lineup, you could hand build one lineup, sim it against the field to see what its expected ROI is. So guys, I hope you enjoy this card. I've been looking forward to it for a very long time. I think there's going to be just top to bottom, a ton of bangers on the fight. So enjoy the card. Good luck this weekend. See you guys back here next week.